Hello everyone, Peter Gifford here, and this is the Esoteric Order of Gamers. Welcome! ISS Vanguard. I'm currently working my way through the game, playing it solo. I haven't got that far yet, but it sort of takes up a lot of space and a lot of time, so I'm going through it and I am going to review it for you in future, but I don't want to review it until I've played some more of it and really got into the nitty-gritty of it. So that's coming soon, but in the meantime, I thought I'd paint up the character miniatures from the game. These are the section heads. You have different sections from the spaceship that go down to planets and explore, and they have a couple of miniatures each, a male and a female one. And even though I have these lovely Sundrop ones, which Awaken kindly sent me, they're lovely colours and everything, but I just wasn't quite connecting to them because I hadn't painted them myself. And I really do prefer to play the game with painted miniatures, even though these are very, very nice indeed. So I thought I'd show you how I painted mine. Now, before we get started, a few thoughts on painting tutorials. I'm very much of the belief that you don't have to slavishly follow the instructions from painting tutorials online. I think it's really useful to be inspired by them, but if you're stuck making sure you have exactly the right paint names that they've specified and that you follow each instruction exactly, I think you're probably missing out on a little bit of the fun of painting. If, for example, it specifies a red colour, just use any red that you have, or in fact, any red that you prefer. You don't have to use the exact brand names. These were created relatively recently by companies, so they could specify exact brand names from their range that you could buy. So back in the old days, I just had a pile of paints and people would just say, use red there, and you grabbed one of your reds. And also, if you learn a few basics about colour mixing, you can save yourself a lot of money because you don't have to buy all the minute shades and hues of different paints that these companies manufacture. You just might have to mix in a little bit of white or a little bit of yellow or whatever to change the colour quite dramatically. So with that said, I'm going to give you a few tips on how I painted these. Use any colours you want because I'm choosing mine pretty arbitrarily. There are no recommended paint jobs of these online, so I'm just going to pick my own colours. Let's get started. Hope you enjoy it. Now I'm just going to spray right over these coloured Sundrop effects. It should be fine. I don't think it'll cover up too much detail or anything like that. I use Citadel colour sprays and I usually use White Scar, and the reason is it's a really fine, high quality paint. It's quite expensive, but I've found it's the best quality spray for priming miniatures. When you prime your miniatures, don't forget to do it in a well ventilated area, and even better, wear a gas mask. And there we have it, all primed and ready to start painting. In previous painting tutorials, I've showed you my paint area. Let's quickly run through it again. Here are the figures all ready to paint. And I've got my racks of paints. These are all my contrast paints, which I'm going to use a lot during this tutorial. And the other paints roughly arranged by hue, just so I can reach a paint quickly. Over here, technical paints and washes and metallics. I've got a little bowl of water and all my brushes. I'm using Rosemary and Co. ones. And this is my red grass wet palette, which is incredibly useful and I use for all my painting. It's got this new membrane now, which is really good. It's re-washable, so you can use it over and over again. It's sitting on a little bit of foam there with a bit of water, and it's keeping it damp, and that'll keep my paints nice and wet as I work. Another thing from Redgrass are these fantastic holders where you can hold your miniatures on them using this putty. And I've actually got a whole lot of these little detachable tops, so I'm sticking my miniatures to these tops, and then I can just put them into the holder very easily, and then you can spin it very, very easily just with your thumb as you're painting. And it's a very handy little device. As you can see, it's small, doesn't take up too much space. Now, one strange thing I do sometimes is I prime my miniatures first and then I check for any mold lines and things, because sometimes mold lines are so subtle you don't really want to bother with them. Once you've primed the figure, you can really see where those mold lines are. So it's a good idea to check out the miniature afterwards and then to scrape off any really obvious lines. And then you can just retouch those bits of priming with some white. I know it seems weird. You often do your cleanup before you prime, but this way you only get rid of the lines that are really obvious. And now I'll just put a bit of white over those bits that I scraped back. And we're ready to start painting properly. Now I'm doing something strange here. I'm using contrast Apothecary white. And I'm going to do this because in these miniatures I want quite a bit of white armor areas. And I thought what I'd do is put the contrast paint over the entire miniature first, and that will define all the detail on the miniatures and make it very easy for me to fill in colors and leave areas white if I want them to. And this actually worked very, very well for these miniatures. There's a lot of detail on them. Sometimes it's a little bit hard to work out what's what. And this gave me a very nice definition to the miniature. It just put a little bit of shadow into the recessed areas and made it easier for me to block in the color later on. So just give all the miniatures a coat of Apothecary white, and of course make sure you clean up any areas where it pulls too much. But when that dries, you'll really see how effective this is. I'll do that to all of the miniatures and then let it dry. And look at that, you can see it's really brought out the detail. And if any of these areas I want to leave them white, well, I'll be able to just paint around them and leave them just like this, and they'll look great. Now I want 4 major colors to match the boards here. These are the department boards: Science, Recon, Engineering and Security. So I'm using contrast Frostheart for security. For engineering I'm using Nazdreg yellow. For recon, that's a tricky one. It's a sort of pink and I don't have a contrast for that. So I'll start with Flesh Terror's red and see if I can work up from that. And Shyish purple for science, even though that's quite a dark purple. As you can see, I'm really relying on contrast paints for this particular one because I want to paint these quickly. And as I said, there's a lot of detail there and contrast paints will sit into it really nicely. So let's get started with the yellow ones. As you can see, as I paint each one of these, I'm just going to pop it on the top of my redgrass holder. I'll give you a link to that below in the show notes if you want to check those out. And what I'm doing is just picking out areas of the armor plating that I want to paint yellow. Now you don't have to match exactly what I've done. You can paint whichever yellow areas you want, whichever black areas you want. There's so much going on in the armor of these figures that you can really come up with any variation you like. But as you can see, that Nazdreg yellow is a really, really good dark yellow. And also, how much easier is it to see what's going on with that Apothecary white contrast paint all over everything. It really is just like paint by numbers now. And the only major decisions I have to make are which areas I'm going to paint yellow. And as you can see, he's starting to look great already. That contrast paint is doing all the work for me and going into the recessed areas and giving me a nice dark shadowed and highlighted yellow. I'll do more highlighting later, of course, but this is a great starting point. Now I can just pop that off my handle and pop another one on and get to work on that. And here's the result of the other yellow figure. As you can see, I've tried to sort of get the yellow spread out nicely in a balanced fashion over the figure. Not too much of it in one spot, and just getting that feeling that it's balanced all over the, in contrast to the white and the other colors that I'll put on. Okay, I'm using that Frostheart now for the blue. And I'm starting here with just painting the detailed visor of the helmet. And there it is finished. I did the cloak as well in the blue. You can see that shades really nicely, that Frostheart color. And this way we're getting the main colors of the 4 departments all over the figure, but it's not dominating the figure. It's nicely balanced with the white and later on the black. Here's the other figure from the blue department. Again, I've done his cloak in that color, or his skirt. And here's the Shyish purple. This is quite a dark purple, but I'll be highlighting this up so it matches the color I want it to match. And finally, here's the last of the purple ones. Now, she's wearing more of a jumpsuit, which I could have painted more purple, but I decided to just scatter it over the figure in this case. Then we've got the red. Now this is again going to be highlighted up to more of a pink colour, but this is a good base. In this case I've painted a jumpsuit in the red. But you can see I haven't done like the whole helmet or anything like that, just the visor, the earpieces, just getting that sense of balance. And here's the last figure. Now this one of course will be dominated by the smoke and flame spraying out of his jetpack. Next I'm going to get out good old black Templar. This is a fantastically useful contrast paint. I use it all the time. Basically everywhere I use black I use this, unless I want a really flat black, in which case I'd use Black Legion. But this black Templar is great. Gives you a black but still with a little bit of a highlight to it. So again, it's just deciding where I'm going to put this and making sure I'm sort of balancing out the colour and the black and the white. And because you're using contrast paints, they just flow so easily on detailed figures like this. They're particularly good for this kind of figure. There's so much detail in there. If you were using a normal paint, you'd probably find it a lot harder. But these lovely contrast paints flow in easily and still retain their pigment. So really I'm just making this up as I go along, deciding which areas I'm going to make black and trying not to overwhelm the figure with the black. And there are the two yellow figures with black added. You can see it's more in the recesses. I've let the yellow be more the armor plates and the things that are sort of sticking out, whereas cords and wires and more recessed stuff are black. In this case, these are the blue ones. Some of the strapping and belts that they have are black, and their guns, well, the guy on the left has a black gun, but the other one has white guns, just for some contrast. The purple, and finally the two red figures. You can see how quickly this is coming together. It's very easy to do. Okay, I'm going to start getting into some more specific colours now. This Mantis warband green I'm going to use for the areas where there are leaves and alien plants. I know alien plants wouldn't necessarily be green, but in this case they are. Now originally I painted most of these alien objects that the biology guy is holding all green, but in the end I decided to use two colours to make them a bit more interesting. You'll see that a bit later. This is Gore Grunta fur. That's another contrast paint I use all the time. It gives it a lovely reddy brown colour. And I decided to use this as a contrast to the blue to just add some interest to the back of her cloak. And you can see the contrast paint. Well, this is a perfect example of me mopping up just a little bit of excess paint there. But otherwise the contrast paint sits really nice in the recesses and gives you that quilting pattern. It's also a great colour for pouches and backpacks and things like that. For the crystals on this base, I'm going to start with Lothern blue. These are just layer paints. Well, this is a layer paint. It's not a contrast paint. So there's crystals sticking out on the base, and they'll highlight that up with white. You'll see a bit later to give it a look of crystals. Now I'm using Skrag brown, another layer paint. And you can see how useful that wet palette is by Redgrass. It keeps paints nice and wet, so I can, well, nice and damp, so I can mix them later if I want to, or go back to them. And I'm making this paint a little bit darker by adding some Dryad bark and some Word Bearer's red to give it a more red tinge. Now you're probably wondering, what am I using this colour for? Well, I've decided to do all the bases now, and I often do the bases halfway through a project, or at least put on the base colour for a base, because it just gives me an idea of what the final figure is going to look like. I can do the rest of the painting with the colour that I'm using for the base. It's quite a handy thing to do. Now, this is not a colour that I usually use to paint bases, but I saw someone do this online and I thought it was nice because it gave a feeling of like being on Mars or something like that. So it's kind of a browny reddy colour. I'll wash this later with Agrax Earthshade to bring out all the detail and then dry brush it. The other good thing about doing bases before you finish the rest of the figure is that if you make a mistake, you haven't completely finished painting of your miniature, so it's not as much of a disaster and you can easily retouch. And I've decided to paint the more fleshy areas of this plant, Gore Grunta fur. That should tie it in nicely with the base as well. Snakebite leather is another very useful contrast paint. Really good brown. And I'm using this for this figure's bit of cloak. Some metallic areas. Leadbelcher is a good starting point for metallics. And there are not too many metallic areas on these figures because they're wearing more modern, colourful sci-fi armour. But I did a bit of metallic on the chainsaw thing that he's wielding. And also he has sort of metal legs, so I painted those metallic as well. And I think I also used it for the exhaust pipes on the jetpack as well that the red figure has. But apart from that, not too much. Skeleton Horde. Now at this point I decided I liked the white, but in some cases it was a little bit too much, especially for pants and things like that. So I decided to tone them down a little bit with some Skeleton Horde. So it gives you a sort of light beigey kind of colour. And this actually added quite a bit of interest to some of the areas of the miniatures. You can see I'm using it for the pants here on this purple figure. It also went very nicely with the green I'd used for the plant life. Just introduced another tone. Now I'm going to do a rough job on this exhaust, starting with white scar. Usually when you have fiery exhausts, you go from the hottest point to the coolest point. And that goes through white to yellow to orange to red and eventually to black. And then if you want to go further than that, the black can even go to grey smoke. This one I did it pretty quickly and easily and just wet blending as I painted it as well. Flash Gitz yellow I used for the yellow next. And really I'm just blobbing it on and then washing my brush and blending it on the miniature itself. You can see I just washed my brush quickly, wiped off the excess water on my towel, and now I can easily wet blend it. Next is Mephiston Red. Just the same technique, blending it in. And finally that goes to Black Templar. With some more blending. And there's your rough effect for the smoke. Now we'll go down into the base a bit as well. I'll fix that later. Once those bases are dry, I'm going to wash them all with good old Agrax Earthshade, the most useful shade paint you'll ever buy. And this will bring out all the detail and shadow in the bases. And this is where we're up to. Still looking a bit messy, but we've got some highlighting and stuff to do yet. Let's let those bases dry and then we'll get on to the next step. Right, it's time to do some detailing and highlighting now, and I'm starting with Basilican Grey. Because the white areas that I did with the Apothecary white just need a little bit more shadow and bring out some of that detail. So Basilican Grey is good for this. Using a fine point of a brush, I'm just bringing out some of that panel lines and things like that in the figures. I don't have to do this too finely or carefully because I can wipe off any excess just with my finger, but a little bit of highlighting of the panels and everything just makes them look stronger. And you can see that's made those white areas look much better. Now I'm going to start highlighting the blue. I'm using Lothern blue again and mixing in a bit of white scar to make it even lighter. And this goes nicely with that contrast paint. Gives me a highlight colour. Now when I do the highlights on these figures, I do a maximum of 2 highlight passes. And by that I mean I'll get a lighter colour, lighter version of the base colour, and do some simple highlighting as you can see here. And then I'll get an even lighter version and do some very, very tiny highlights just to make it pop a little bit more. So here I'm just highlighting areas of the figure where the light would hit from above, the edges of armour panels, things like that. It's very quick and easy to do. You don't have to agonise over it and make it absolutely perfect. This is just making the colours have more depth and make them look as though the figure is larger than it actually is. Just any area that would hit the light coming from above, hit it with some of that lighter colour. On a cloak or something like that, you can see you can paint in something a little bit darker and you can have it blend a little bit if you want to be bothered. Just to the edge of the cloak there. This really gives the figure a lot of depth. With contrast paint these days, you don't have to do this step, but it does take a pretty average paint job up to a much, much better one. And the great thing is a lot of the work is already done for you by the contrast paint. You're just improving on it. And this is the opportunity to also retouch any areas where the contrast paint has gone blotchy or anything like that. You can emphasize the folds in cloth like I am here, and just make the whole figure pop. Remember, the goal is not to paint everything. You're just adding in highlights so you don't have to paint the edge of every single shape. Now I can use Dawnstone to do the same for the black areas and give them a little bit of a highlight as well. This is quite a strong contrast between the Black Templar and the Dawnstone, but it just makes those black areas pop. This really does make a difference to the black. As you can see, Black Templar does a great job of instant highlighting, but it really just does need a little bit more. You can make that even a little bit lighter with some white scar and then just pop on some tiny little highlights. Just little dots and things. This will just give the impression that light is hitting these areas and add even more depth. This is where you need a good quality brush too, because you want a nice sharp point. As I said, I'm using Rosemary & Co brushes, Sable, Kolinsky Sable, but Winsor & Newton ones are very good as well. Synthetics won't do the job for this kind of thing. Well, if they do, they won't do it for very long. Now that little second pass, slightly lighter on the blue as well. You can see it's almost to white there. Using a very, very light blue just to add another little layer of highlighting to the blue. And sometimes you can put on little marks like this. I know this is weird, but it gives the feeling that an object is worn and that it has some use. And little random dots here and there just add that sense of light hitting it. I often use the very sharp edge of a brush just to add in a few little scrapes and lines, and it just gives that feeling of wear. So this guy's almost done. Oh, I've got to do the base yet, don't I? Well, to do the base, I'm going to use Tuskgor fur and dry brush that dark brown that we've already got. This gives a nice sort of reddy browny colour. Use an old brush, make sure you wipe most of it off on the towel, and then just brush it over the raised areas. And already that's starting to look great. When that's dry, I'll go a little bit lighter using Kislev flesh. Be careful you don't hit the miniature you've just painted. And that's a great base. It doesn't matter actually if you get some of this colour on the boots and everything, because it just looks like dust and dirt on the boots. And often putting a lot of dirt and everything around the feet of a miniature gives it a really nice feeling of being grounded to the base. So I don't feel you have to be neat around there, because people walking around on alien planets, they're going to get dirty boots. I just added a little bit of Ushabti bone to that flesh as well, just to go a teeny bit higher, a little bit lighter. It's purely a matter of personal choice. That just lifted it a little bit more on the few bits here and there. Now when I pop it off my base, my holder, I am going to paint the edge as well, and I'm going to paint them in the section head colours. So Lothern blue is a great match for the player board I showed you earlier, and I'll use that to run some colour around the edge of the base so I can very much recognise this miniature at a glance and which department they belong to. If you use this technique and you get the right angle, you should be able to paint it quite easily. This base edge kind of blends into some of the texture, or the modelled texture a bit, so you have to be a little bit more careful than usual. And there he is, he's looking good. And that was very, very quick and easy to paint. Now I'm going to use the same techniques for all the other models. You can see he's matching his board pretty well, the security board, and I'm very happy with that paint job. It's got a lot of detail in there, and it was done very, very quickly indeed. So let's get on to all the other miniatures and paint them in the same way, adding a couple of layers of highlight and doing the bases, and then adding the colour around the rims. Here's the other blue one, quickly done. Added a little bit of contrast by doing the brown pouches there, and also that matches the back of her skirt. Now you may go back to some of these figures and decide you haven't got the balance quite right. I felt that the legs of this one probably needed a little bit more. He was very top heavy in the yellow and there was not much around the legs. So I decided to add some more yellow to the armor plating pieces around the leg area, just to balance out the colour some more. Alright, that's better. There are areas, especially flat areas, where the colour can get a little bit blotchy, so you might want to get in with a layer paint and retouch those areas, add a bit of flat colour. It's not too necessary on detailed figures like this because there's so much detail, but if there are flat colours it may be blotchy, so it's very easy to go in and just retouch during the highlighting stage. Now I'm starting to highlight the yellow. I've used Averland Sunset in this case, and to highlight I'm mixing Ushabti bone in with it. Averland Sunset was a good match for the original contrast colour. And that worked out rather nicely. Now the crystals you can see I've done very roughly, just a bit of light colour over the blue, a few lines. I could have spent ages making those look just like crystals, but I just wanted to get a quick effect for the base. Here's this guy. I've added a red dot into the center of his chest, and yeah, look at all that detail. There's a lot of stuff on these figures, a lot of gubbins. Using Moot green and mixing it with a bit of white scar gives me a good highlight for that alien plant life which is on some of these bases. So I'm going to go back in and paint up some of those ferns and everything and make it look a bit cleaner. I'm using Kislev flesh to highlight those brown fleshy plant mushroom things. And then I'll use Averland Sunset to dot in the round dots on them. So to highlight the purple, I was going to use Genestealer purple, but I opened this container and found that it had all dried up, which is very disturbing. I wish the paints didn't dry up. So instead I ended up using Xereus purple, which is a darker purple, mixed it with a little bit of white, and it was almost exactly the same thing. And that's what I mean, you know, did I ever need Genestealer purple when Xereus purple with a bit of white is the same as Genestealer purple? This is where you can save yourself money. And here's the purple guy with his strange alien plants. And I think those beige sort of trousers highlighted with a bit of white added to the Ushabti bone, they come out really nicely. Add a little bit more contrast to this and blend nicely with the green and the brown mushroomy things. Same techniques we used for the other purple person. Again, a little bit of beige instead of white, just to make it a little bit more interesting. Goes better with the darker color, I think. Now the last one I have to do is the red, and it's actually quite a pink color. So I've used Pink Horror, which is very, very close to the section color. So now I want to highlight up this red to the pink color. It's very easy to do. The red is good as a nice dark shade, and I can put this on as a highlight and really give it that different color, which will match my boards a bit better. And once I've done this, I can highlight a little bit more by adding a bit of white scar to the pink. And there we go, that's turned out rather nicely. That's one of the figures. Of course, we've got that pink line around the base. And here's our other guy. And I've just blended some of that dry brushing of the base into the smoke, so it all just looks like it's swirling together on the base. Again, you could go to lots more effort here detailing all that base, but I think this does the job nicely. Now a little bit later on I realized I hadn't highlighted this one fully. I hadn't done the blacks yet, so a bit later on I highlighted that, and I also did a little bit of black wash over those metallic areas, and just generally a bit more highlighting on this guy for the final effect. And here they all are, the 8 department heads, section chiefs that you'll be using in ISS Vanguard. And I'm very pleased with these results, and this really just took me less than a day, really. Very easy to do, as you can see, and yet they look very, very detailed. In fact, it looks as though there's a lot more work has gone into them than actually did. Well, there we have it, a very quick and effective method of painting the main characters from ISS Vanguard. And I'm really looking forward to going back and playing some more of this game with these figures painted now, because I don't know about you, but I just feel more of a connection to their fates if they've been painted. I don't know why. This technique worked really well. I just spent one day painting these figures, and of course I was filming at the same time, which slowed me down even more. So really you could do it in half a day. And the thing is, the whole idea with this method is to give the impression that you've painted all that fine detail, but actually you haven't really. You've let the contrast paints do most of the work. And then when it comes to highlighting, don't go through and highlight every single little fine detail. Just pop on some little highlights. You can do like at the most 2 layers of highlighting, and it will make them pop and give a feeling of a lot of detail, even though you haven't done every single little corner and line and all the rest of it. And from a distance, they look fantastic. Of course, if you get right up close, you'll see, oh, it's a little bit messy, but down here, it's going to look fantastic. And I highly recommend painting this way when you're doing board game figures and things like this, where they're not for display, they're not for showing off, they're just for making them look good so you enjoy your game more. That's the way I like to paint anyway, and because I've got so many figures to paint and such a backlog to get through, speed is very, very important to me, and that's why I find contrast paints very, very useful. The other thing about this technique that was slightly different was painting them all with that white contrast paint to start with, and that really helped to bring out the detail and make it easy to decide where I applied the various colors and brought out the color style of each of the 4 different departments. So an interesting technique. You can always learn new things, come up with new ways of speeding up your painting and still getting good results. I hope this has been very, very useful. Now, of course, I will be doing a review of ISS Vanguard. I've already done the rules and reference, which you can download from my website at orderofgamers.com. There's a review coming when I just spend a little bit more time with it. I would love to do it all in one go and get it out quickly, but I've got lots and lots of games to cover, and ISS Vanguard is a very time-consuming game that demands a lot of attention. So I'm trying to give it the right amount of attention before I do a review. But it is on the way, and I hope you'll enjoy that, and you've enjoyed this video. I will see you next time. Thanks very much for watching. This is Peter from the Esoteric Order of Gamers. I'll see you next time.